This seminar is always organized by Fondation Gabriel Péri. It is a partnership with two universities, University of Rouen and University of Dijon. And today, this seminar aims to explore the history of Eurocommunism, especially, but not only because there's a prehistory of the history of Eurocommunism in the 1970s. And so the opportunity is provided by a series of publications of record on forthcoming publication, especially in German, about history of communism, sources and introduction of these debates. So we invite today 4 colleagues to speak about this topic. Unfortunately, I should apologize to our colleague Francesco Di Palma from Freie Universität Berlin, because he's ill and terrible ill, so he can't connect today. But our colleague Maximilian Graf will read this paper, so we have all the paper for the discussion today. So I will briefly introduce each speaker, one per one. And so we can start now the discussion. Alors, pour le public français, je ferai un résumé rapide en français des communications qui vont être donc lues en anglais. I will present the first speaker. So on the prehistory of Eurocommunism. So Maximilian Graf, he's an historian. He worked at the University of Vienna in Austria. He is a specialist of the Cold War studies and, of course, of the history of communism too. He was, during a long time, a postdoc, among other university, at Austrian Academy of Science and the University of Vienna. And so he's working on Eurocommunism, and he will publish the next year a book about Eurocommunism with lots of translations of text coming from former Soviet Union, from East Germany, from Italy, from French and other countries. So he will publish collected works, very important works on this topic. And so he's a specialist of Cold War II, and he's a specialist of the relationship between Austria and former East Germany. He has written a book, so auf Deutsch, Österreich und die Deutsche Demokratische Republik, Politik und Wirtschaft im Schatten der deutschen Teilung. So in English, so it in Austria and the German Democratic Republic, so politics and economy in the shadow of the German division, so published in 2016. And so today, he will especially present some remarks in a paper about the prehistory of Eurocommunism, because, as probably some of colleagues know, the prehistory in Austria is important for Eurocommunism and other countries too. So please, Maximilian, for the introduction of this debate and this seminar on Eurocommunism. Then we will work after more on specific case, on Italian case, French case, the relationship with European Union, and the relationship with the Soviet bloc. So please start. Thank you very much for coming here, not only online, but in Paris University. Thank you very much. And I will, no, please introduce now. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jean-Numa. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation and the kind introduction. I will now give a presentation for which I picked the title, Eurocommunism avant la lettre. And in this presentation, I will provide you with some remarks on, as Jean-Numa said, Western reform communisms and interactions before the 1970s. So it might be a bit strange and surprising that an Austrian scholar whose French is by far not good enough to give a talk in French picks a French title for his presentation in English. However, avant la lettre is a by far more beautiful expression than the English phrase before the word, and it perfectly frames what I'm going to talk about in the next 25 minutes or so. As we all know, Eurocommunism is a term coined in 1975 that quickly became commonly accepted by scholars and journalists studying the phenomenon, by Western diplomats and politicians, fearing its impact on Western societies and political systems, and even by Soviet and other communist functionaries criticizing it. Far slower and less by the communist parties labeled Eurocommunists themselves. Over time, many communist parties across the globe were characterized as Eurocommunist, but the Italian, Spanish, and French communist parties were always at the center of interest. Given their size and importance, there's nothing wrong about it. However, we still can learn much more about reform communisms if we look at smaller communist parties, mutual influences, and think in broader time horizons. Most studies on Eurocommunism start out with the year 1968 and the criticism voiced after the Warsaw Pact intervention in Czechoslovakia that ended the probably most fascinating reform communist experiment. A project that had not only aimed at socialism with a human face, but was also regarded as a sincere attempt toward democratic socialism by many Western communists of the time. Meanwhile, researchers have looked for the origins of reform thought and policies within the various communist parties, as we are also doing in this joint volume we're going to publish this or next year. I'm just dropping keywords because the experts surrounding me have studied this in much more detail, and we will have plenty of time to listen to their remarks. The Italian party, the PGE, had Antonio Gramsci and the Resistenza. The French party, the PCF, had the interwar experience of a Popular Front government, of course, the Resistance, and a diverse intellectual background. It is certainly true that much reform thought originated in these specific national backgrounds, outstanding intellectuals and functionaries, and their later reception in a post-Stalinist world shaped it. At the level of comparison, the Italian and the French case stand out, and to my left, Marco Di Maggio has done impressive research on this in a more long-term view, especially regarding intellectuals. In my view, we can still learn more about Eurocommunism by putting it into a broader context of the various post-Stalinist reform communisms in Eastern and Western Europe, as well as by looking at smaller parties, as I already mentioned, often left out of the grand narratives on Eurocommunism, focusing on PGE, PCF, and PCE. Moreover, the various national reform attempts influenced each other. And the Eurocommunist interactions of the 1970s are nothing that came out of the blue as a consequence of 1968. Indeed, meetings of Western European communist parties have been held since 1959, when some of them met for the first time on their own initiative in Rome and not in Moscow or some other place picked by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU. No doubt, this was a far cry from the developments of the 1970s, but still, it marked the beginning of a post-Stalinist Western European internationalism, characterized by less unity and by far more diversity already visible in the 1960s. With these opening remarks, I somehow resonate what Maud Bracke has written in her study, Which Socialism Who's the Daunt, in which she analyzed Western European communism and the Czechoslovak crisis of 1968. Let me quote one of her most important theses, quote, "The invasion, the subsequent realignment of the communist world and the static détente that came about all prevented the West European communist cluster from developing into an actual strategic alliance. In this sense, that 1968 marked the end rather than the start of Eurocommunism. The events of 1968 indicated the limits of domestic or inter-bloc dissent in terms of changing bloc strategies and internal organization," unquote. While I agree with much of Bracke's conclusions regarding a Eurocommunist moment in 1968, in the immediate aftermath of the intervention crushing the Prague Spring, and also a bit with regard to the long-term decline of the phenomenon towards the end of the decade, I believe she really underestimates the power of Eurocommunism in the mid-1970s, for example, especially within the framework of the Berlin Conference of Communist and Workers' Parties in 1976. Be that as it may, I will now focus on the history of reform communism before 1968, and my emphasis will be on some Western European interactions, East-West influences, and especially the development of the Communist Party of Austria in international comparison. The necessity of reforming the socialist states and international relations among communists and communist parties was evident by 1956 at the latest, after Khrushchev's secret speech and the uprisings in Poland and Hungary. Since then, various steps and experiments have been carried out, be it the national communist paths of the Polish and Romanian state parties, the formation phase of Kadarism in Hungary, or the Prague Spring, which was preceded by years of a liberalization process in Czechoslovakia. Or, as I would like to emphasize, the Western European discussions, interactions, and repositionings that all happened after 56, especially in the 1960s. The consequences of the transnational domino effect of 1956, as Silvio Pons once told it in a talk, as far as I remember, were very different in the Western European Communist parties. The first results were not only the politicismo thesis of the Italian party leader, Palmiro Togliatti, but also further deviations from unquestioning loyalty to Moscow. Early examples could also be, for example, the Swedish party with its rejection of any traditional kind of internationalism, or, for example, the Dutch party, which had very strong Chinese fractions. In my view, with regard to West European interactions, it's very significant that you can see from the sources that the PGE after 1956 spoke of an opening of the movement to all revolutionary and progressive forces, allargamento, and that the PGE was very, very reserved of any kind of revival of whatever kind of Comintern, Comintern, or be it in the way of conferences or else. Even though those differences of the so-called world movement were already quite obvious, the CPSU succeeded in convening a world conference in 1957, which for the last time demonstrated the greatest possible degree of unity. Despite the resurgence of the belief in the superiority of Soviet-style socialism in the Sputnik era, I think we should not forget about that, this was finally no longer possible on the occasion of the next World Conference in 1960, as the Sino-Soviet split already loomed on the horizon. Thereafter, not only Sino-Soviet relations deteriorated further, but also the situation in the East, the West, and in East-West relations in Europe got by far more diverse. The CPSU kept pushing for a new World Conference, which did not materialize until 1969. This was an issue debated throughout almost all of the 1960s, and the conference was initially planned to happen shortly after the intervention in Czechoslovakia, then was postponed mostly due to the efforts of the PG and the Romanian party. And I think also with this context of having this plan of Moscow organizing a conference, demonstrating unity, settling accounts with the Chinese as a background to the West European interactions is very important. In this regard, the 60s are a very fascinating period. I will now briefly introduce you to the history of the Austrian Communist Party, for the sake of brevity, henceforth KPÖ, which is the German abbreviation for Kommunistische Partei Österreichs. And I'm trying to put its development in relation with Eastern developments and Western interactions. Despite remarkable merits in the resistance 1933 to 1945, in retrospect, the decade from 1945 to 1955 was the most successful period in the history of the KPÖ, not least because the party was represented in the Austrian parliament from 1945 to 1959, and from 1945 to 1947, even in governmental responsibility, like the French and the Italian parties. Nevertheless, the KPÖ never achieved more than 5% of the overall votes and remained an outcast of Austrian politics. Lacking the tradition of a workers' party in Austria, always occupied by socialists or social democrats, whatever they call themselves, and burdened by its close relationship to the Soviet occupation power. Austria was under Allied occupation from 45 to 55. The KPÖ never managed to gain a significant voter base. In the first post-war decade, the KPÖ was a clear-cut Stalinist party. It joined the condemnation of Tito, praised the brutal Sovietization of Eastern Europe, publicly justified the show trials, and ruthlessly participated in every reversal of Soviet policy. After the signing of the Austrian State Treaty in 1955, through which Austria regained its sovereignty and as part of the deal subsequently opted for neutrality, as well as the disillusioning effects of Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech at the 20th Party Congress of the CPSU and his crackdown on the Hungarian uprising in 1956, the KPÖ lost about 1/3 of its membership. Criticism within the party arose, but these discussions were aborted in favor of the unity of the party. Indeed, the development in the neighboring people's democracies made it even harder to promote socialism on the domestic scene. Upon the next elections in 1959, the KPÖ had lost its last members of parliament. I've already mentioned this conference in Rome of West European Communist parties in the very same year. They lost the last members of parliament. And at this conference in Rome, even the Stalinist, Cominform trained functionaries who had spent the wartime in exile in Moscow showed a great deal of interest in the tactics of the PGE, which they would later openly reject from the 1960s onwards. Despite continuing marginalization on the domestic political level in the 1960s, some enlightened officials of the Austrian communists became masterminds of, in my view, early Euro-communist ideas. Against the background of the Stalinist socialization of the leaders, as well as the party's rank and file, this development seems somehow surprising and already implies, in my view, the reason why the Austro-Euro-communist experiment failed in the end. Two remarkable characters shaped this phase. First, Ernst Fischer, the most prominent Austrian communist intellectual, and Franz Marek, the guy I wrote the book about together with colleagues. So I'm not going to say too much because I won't stop talking if I start. Maybe to briefly mention, he grew up in interwar Red Vienna in poverty. He has a Jewish background. He emigrated in 1938 to Paris, where he was active in the Resistance. And when he returned after the Second World War, he was a clear-cut Stalinist. But then he got in touch with the thoughts of Antonio Gramsci, experienced the Italian party, and started to adopt the Italian ideas to the Austrian party. Fischer is more important for introducing communist criticism on the situation in socialist states and later also in the Soviet Union. And I think both characters brought to the fore ways of thinking about the future of communism, about how to think about the Soviet Union, about the socialist states that were most prominent in the Euro-communist parties of the 1970s. In the early 1960s, it was clearly the case that still the developments in the communist states of Eastern Europe were in the center of attention of the Austrian communists. But the reception of them gradually became a matter of Western European interaction. I will not go into much detail about the Sino-Soviet split, but just to mention that this is the first time you can see a bit of ping-pong between the Austrian and Italian party media, like quoting the statements of politicians of other parties. The PG often quoted Franz Marek's positions. And roughly at the same time, we can also see the first open criticism of the Soviet Union. And this criticism was not limited to the Italian party. And you can clearly see that Western transnational interactions and also interactions across the Iron Curtain mattered a lot. It becomes particularly evident in the example of culture. And this is also, in my view, a central feature of Eurocommunism in the 1970s, namely the ability and will to openly and publicly criticized the Soviet Union for whatever motives in whatever field. And this is clearly there already in the 1960s. And to stick with the Soviet example, after the thaw of the first Khrushchev years, the Soviet leader adopted a harsh and anti-intellectual and anti-modernist stance by the beginning of the 60s. So any kind of modern art was not welcome in Moscow anymore. And this, of course, was a challenge for West European communists, because this is something, it was basically the conclusion: we cannot sell this. Our people are not going to accept this. And in this case, you can see there's criticism in Italy, most prominently by Palmiro Togliatti. And also in Austria, Franz Marek organized a public debate about cultural policies in the socialist states, not only in the Soviet Union, also about the liberalization going on in Czechoslovakia, or the maltreatment of the dissident scientist Robert Habermann in East Germany, and so on. All this was a part of a public debate, and the East German SED, I think we will learn much more about that in the paper by Francesco Di Palma, which is always a kind of watchdog of revisionist tendencies in Western parties throughout the 1960s. And the SED assumed with great concern that the Italian position had found its echo in the Austrian party. And this concern was even more increased by the reactions of both the Italian and the Austrian parties to Khrushchev's ousting from power in 1964. Both parties had been taken by surprise by this step and not informed in advance. And the Italian party criticized the way the decision had been made, and especially how it had been communicated. And very, very similar statements were made by the Austrian party. In my reading, Togliatti's position was very much in line with what he had written in his famous Yalta Memorandum, which he had written a few hours before he had died earlier that year. And this political testament, in his political, Togliatti had summarized his views on the communist world movement dissenting from the Soviet position, specifically on the question of the necessity of a World Conference dealing with Chinese positions, and something that usually goes a bit unnoticed when reading Togliatti's memorandum. He clearly said that the weakest Western European parties would have burdened with the struggle with the Chinese, instead of aiming at improving their domestic political influence. And in this manner, Togliatti had argued in favor of accepting political realities of Western Europe, fighting them by winning over a higher percentage of the electorate, with more openness toward other political, social, and religious groups. And this is kind of like, this became the true connection between the Austrian and the Italian parties. This is the key moment. Togliatti's memorandum is the key moment that made the Austrian reform course possible. By the mid-1960s, the growing and very influential reformist flow within the KPÖ was about to be formalized as the party's official line. And at its 19th party congress in 1965, the KPÖ adopted a reformist program, which was to a large extent written by Marek and heavily influenced by the ideas of the Italian communist leader Togliatti. The Congress brought about the long overdue generational change in the leadership, and additionally, the reformist wing also controlled the party media. This constituted a setting for an atmosphere in which an open discussion of reformist ideas was possible, not only within the KPÖ, but also on a European scale. Throughout the 1960s, Marek organized lectures and discussions in Vienna with leading communist intellectuals, to mention just Ernesto Ragionieri, Lucio Lombardo Radice, or from the French party, Roger Garaudy, and many more speakers from East and West. Their papers were all published in the theoretical journal of the KPÖ named Weg und Ziel. But Marek did not only engage in intellectual debates of a mostly German-speaking communist world, he also aimed at discussing those issues at the party level. And in 1966, He was the main organizer of a conference of West European Communist parties in Vienna. And his introductory presentation really forestalled most of the Eurocommunist ideas of the 1970s. For Marek, who was this conference in Vienna was a logical follow-up to the similar conference in Brussels in 1965, which had marked a restart of such meetings after initial attempts as the one I mentioned in Rome. While the conference in Brussels had dealt mostly with contemporary issues like the Vietnam War, the question of European security, and solidarity with persecuted fraternal parties, all issues on which you could easily agree, even if you have different opinions on other topics. Marek proposed in Vienna a continuation of this discussion. Despite being aware of national characteristics, he aimed at discussing common European challenges in the capitalist countries. The changes since the interwar period, for example, the improved living conditions for the working class, demanded a new approach to domestic politics. To reform communists like Marek, it was evident that socialism had to be attained within the framework of a Western European democracy. Therefore, the question of the communist relationship to Catholics and socialists or social democrats had to be debated anew, not only by intellectuals, but also by the parties as a whole. The basic questions were about to become some of the core problems with which Eurocommunism dealt in the 1970s. Nonetheless, it seemed that in 1966, the time was not yet ripe for such a discussion. But we know from the sources, from the Italian sources, from the reports of the PGE, that the Italian communists appreciated the recently developed awareness of the Austrian and other parties in that direction. In fulfilling their tasks as Eastern agents within the framework of Western European communism, the illegal West German communists reported and complained about Marek's negative attitude toward the GDR in front of the SED Politburo, and internal SED assessments of Western Communist parties at the time spoke of bourgeois influences within the Italian, Austrian, and to a lesser extent, the French party. However, the shape,
5 minutes,
yeah,
that's okay.
Get to the end. However, the shape of the KPÖ media and its international appearance did not correspond to the internal situation of the party. Those who could have backed this curse, this reformist curse, in a standoff with orthodoxy, had left the party a decade earlier as a consequence of 1956. Instead, the Austrian Eurocommunist experiment was attacked and fought not only from within the party, but also by the East European state parties, first and foremost the East German communists, but they always acted in close cooperation with the Soviet Communist Party, which delegated this task of dealing with the Austrian party to the German communists, as they had already done in the interwar period during the Comintern years. The degree of cooperation is still hard to assess, but we have some archival evidence on that. Since the reformers held strong positions in the Politburo and in the party media, in 1968, the KPÖ publicly welcomed socialism with a human face. Internally, conflicts on the appraisal of the Czechoslovakian reforms aggravated. The KPÖ officially condemned the crackdown on the Prague Spring by the Warsaw Treaty powers. This was a result of the composition of the party's leadership and the wait-and-see attitude adopted by the enemies of reform. After the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the KPÖ, with the aim of discussing the consequences on a multilateral level, had called for a conference of West European Communist parties. And we can also see in the minutes of the Direzione of the PGE that Berlinguer mentioned this initiative twice and seemed to be very interested. But the idea, however, was finally rejected by the Western fraternal parties. The main reason was for sure that the Soviet communists heavily opposed such a conference and were pressing the French and Italian parties not to take part in such an event. Although both the French and the Italian parties openly opposed the intervention, the time was not yet ripe for a joint action by Western European communist Western European communists. Being the most influential communist parties in the West, they avoided siding with an extremely small fraternal party from within whose ranks comrades were even calling for an open split with the Soviet Union, like most prominently Ernst Fischer did. To keep the long story short, this led to open conflict, and in the end, the opponents of reform within the party had already started to prepare to have a standoff with the reformers at the next party congress, which already took place in January 1969, ironically at the 20th party congress of the KPÖ. And for the sake of the unity of the party, the reformers were only gradually removed from the party. First to be expelled was Ernst Fischer because of his public statements. A year later, he was followed by Franz Marek and many others. And to connect again with the Italian party, the PG intellectual Lombardo Radice warningly referred to their fate when the Central Committee of the PG debated about the Il Manifesto group, Osanda and others, and their future in the party. In 1971, the normalization of the KPÖ was completed. The party took back the condemnation of the intervention in 1968. Thereafter, the KPÖ returned to an entirely Muscovite line on Eurocommunism, actual Eurocommunism. The party took a negative stance. Those who had crowded out the KPÖ reformers still feared possible influences or return of reformist ideas propagated by the larger Western European parties in the 1970s. For the reformers, first and foremost, the case I know best, Franz Marek, they remained very supportive of Eurocommunism, but also critical observers with much doubt about how the French party would develop in that case. Always big fans of the Italian party. And until their death, they believed that 1968 could have changed the course of history for communism, not only through the powerful example of the Prague Spring, but also by a joint Western reaction to its tragic fate. And with this, I thank you for your attention. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Just before a short summary in French, thanks to the University of Paris to host this meeting and to Rasmus especially, sorry, a little bit tired, and thanks to Institut Universitaire de France, it's my project, to support this seminar too. So, donc, pour les collègues qui suivent, un très bref résumé en français pour dire que donc c'était une préhistoire de l'eurocommunisme, c'est-à-dire avant les années 1970, là où on parle d'habitude à partir des années 1970. Et bon, il y a une introduction générale soulignant justement le fait que c'est la construction peut-être d'un renouveau de l'internationalisme occidental sous certaines formes, mais le point important et qui, il est vrai, est souvent méconnu dans l'histoire de l'eurocommunisme, c'est le rôle assez important au niveau intellectuel d'un certain nombre de figures du Parti communiste autrichien, qui est un petit parti communiste en Europe occidentale. Enfin, c'est le propre de l'Autriche d'être un peu coincé, mais bon, bref, qui était un parti qui a fait 5% tout au plus entre 1945 et 1955, et qui ensuite a été vraiment assez groupusculaire, mais qui joue un certain rôle dans l'équilibre Est-Ouest, et au sein duquel il y a des figures intellectuelles et politiques assez importantes, lues et traduites un petit peu en Europe de l'Ouest comme en Europe de l'Est, notamment Ernst Fischer et Franz Marek, donc à propos duquel notre collègue a publié un ouvrage. Et donc, il montre qu'en gros, il y a deux séquences, c'est que ce qu'on peut appeler, ce qui va devenir ensuite l'eurocommunisme, l'idée qu'il peut y avoir un communisme au niveau occidental spécifique autour d'un certain nombre de questions. En plus, c'est dans le contexte du traité européen, ça a été rappelé. Cette idée naît intellectuellement sous la plume notamment de Fischer et Marek. Voilà. Et ensuite, le collègue a décrit, je vais être très bref, donc on y reviendra en plus, je sais, avec le papier de Francesco Di Palma sur, il y a en quelque sorte un jeu transnational assez intéressant avec l'Allemagne de l'Est qui est le poisson pilote pour surveiller tout cela en Europe de l'Ouest, mais et d'autant plus les Autrichiens, puisque bon, il y a une sorte d'espace linguistique et d'histoire commune qui fait que c'est tout à fait important. Et en même temps, donc, il y a beaucoup d'interactions entre les Italiens et les Autrichiens à ce moment-là, au début des années 60, notamment avec Togliatti, au moment où les prodromes, notamment le mémorandum de Togliatti, sont avancés. La crise de Tchécoslovaquie de 1968 est évidemment un point clé là-dedans, sachant qu'il y a une normalisation assez forte dès 1969 avec l'exclusion en tant que telle. Hein. Je crois, he was expelled in 1969, Hans Fischer, de la direction du KPE, alors que c'était le plus connu de loin à l'échelle internationale. Et à partir de 1971, peu de temps après, en gros, le parti autrichien revient sur une ligne très pro-Moscou et sort un peu de l'histoire de l'eurocommunisme, tout en ayant été à l'origine du mouvement, pour résumer. Voilà. Donc, j'espère que c'était à peu près clair, voilà, comme résumé. C'est bref hein, par rapport à... Mais voilà, c'était les idées directrices pour que tout le monde puisse suivre et qu'on puisse continuer la séance du séminaire. Peut-être on continue les interventions, on aura un temps de discussion après. We can talk now and we have a discussion after. So, the second speaker is Silvio Pons. He's a professor in contemporary history, so a Scuola Normale Superiore de Pisa. He is very famous for the history of communism. He has published several articles on books, especially, but not only on Italian communism. And among the other books, he is the coordinator, the main coordinator of the Cambridge History of Communism, published in 2017, in 3 volumes. So thank you very much for coming here. And he will now speak about the Eurocommunism in the general framework about Eurocommunism in 1970s, with, of course, the very important case of Italian communism. So thank you for coming here. And so, okay, so.
Merci beaucoup. And thank you for the invitation for organizing this seminar. Let me start with a general overview, which widely corresponds to a shared picture. Around the mid-1970s, so the argument goes usually, Eurocommunism challenged the bipolar world order and the Soviet model by establishing a connection between the chance of entering the sphere of government in Western countries, the prospect of a new European space distinct from the Atlantic nexus, and the idea of promoting change in the communist world. The Eurocommunists supported policies directed at overcoming the bloc divide and reaffirmed their revolutionary calling while embracing pluralism, democracy, and human rights as universal values. They represented a source of destabilization, not only for the United States and NATO, but also for the Soviet Union. They established an agenda in competition with the European socialist left and supported European integration with the ambition of helping to construct Europe as a third pole in world politics. At the same time, they contributed undermining the unity of a communist movement while presenting the threat of an upset to the communist regime in Central and Eastern Europe. This sounded appealing to some extent in Rome and Paris, as well as in Warsaw or Budapest, while causing concern, obviously, in Washington and in Moscow, but also in Bonn. Eurocommunism was perceived with varying degrees of interest, skepticism, and hostility, though for some time its ideas and policies stimulated political and intellectual curiosity, as demonstrated by wide analytical literature, politological literature, late 1970s, early 1980s. Think of such different authors as different between each other as Blackmer, Kriegel, Timmerman, Sartori, and others. Now, I assume this as being the basic narrative about Eurocommunism, In my paper today, however, I wish to stress how such picture hides inconsistencies and differences within the Eurocommunist movement, which were not just the consequence of national contexts. The literature, right up to most recent times, has often assumed Eurocommunism to have been such a unitary and coherent phenomenon, and has thus missed focusing on its basic disunion. My main point here is that we should make a distinction between the notion of Eurocommunism and the notion of so-called reform communism, which has been used also by Maximilian. If we assume the latter as a transnational set of ideas aimed at reforming both political culture and the party states in power, on the pattern established by the Prague Spring and socialism with a human face. To put it simply, not all Eurocommunists were reform communists, and this eventually represented an essential fracture. It was only the Italian leading group that cultivated the perspective of liquidating the old internationalism by combining the opportunities of Ostpolitik and Europeanization, and made an effort to transform their own political culture so as to acquire new languages and paradigms connected with the forces of movement that had emerged globally outside the binary schemes of the Cold War. Even in global perspective, such fracture in the political culture of Western communism seems evident. Eurocommunism did not extend outside Europe, with the remarkable exception of Japan and later in part of Brazil, but made use of a conspicuous networks of transnational political relations with the colonial and post-colonial countries that had been established by the two main Western parties over time. However, the role played by the Italians was quite different from that of the French, partly because of the respective national and post-imperial specificity, but also because of basic divergences. In the 1970s, their links with the Third World, most of all in the Mediterranean and in Africa, no longer intersected the revolutionary charge of the anti-colonial struggles, but they contributed instead to the ideas of a new world order, reformed and different from the unequal and neo-colonial one, whose ambition was to modify the global agenda thanks to the decline of American hegemony after Vietnam. Such visions made the PCI closer to Yugoslavia than to the socialist camp, and to the SPD more than the PCF, as far as the perspective of North-South relations was concerned. The alliance between the Italian, French, and Spanish communist parties, formally established in February 1977, faded rather quickly on account of their irreconcilable political positions and as a consequence of the reaction of the Soviets. Such an alliance had always been rather precarious. Even at the peak of their encounter, the PCI and the PCF, the only mass communist parties in Western Europe, displayed different views on crucial issues. Not only was it almost exclusively the Italian communists who invented the main features of Eurocommunism, but despite their shared purpose of promoting a Western communist agenda, the mutual understanding between the two parties proved to be poor on several crucial points. Their respective evaluation of the Portuguese Revolution, 1974, showed even before the birth of the alliance a divergence hard to reconcile. Furthermore, while the Italians supported the idea of strengthening European political institutions, The French opposed any transfer of national sovereignty. The PCI stepped up its support for Ostpolitik and European detente much more than the PCF did. And although both leaderships criticized Soviet orthodoxy, Marchais never really joined the third way between the Soviet model and social democracy proposed by Berlinguer. Even though both parties endorsed the topic of human rights, the French communists would abandon it soon. Consequently, the Euro-Communist alliance could not open the way to a coherent political movement. As we know, Moscow reacted very sharply to the launching of the alliance, but such reaction was influenced essentially on the French leadership, while Moscow attempted in vain to intimidate Berlinguer by threatening a split PCI, as was indeed put into effect in the Spanish case. At the same time, the Italian communists were alone in their criticism of the Soviet and Cuban support of the regime of Mengistu in Ethiopia. In fact, the war in the Horn of Africa deepened the fractures in international communism, giving rise to serious questioning about the politics of Soviet power in the south of the world, which now entered into the arsenal of reform communism in Italy, and only in Italy. And also secretly, we may say, in Moscow, in the international department of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but this was not evident at the times, of course. My arguments are not intended to deny the importance of national context. The ascent of communist parties in France and Italy was, in fact, the main reason why Euro-communism was perceived in Washington as a threat. While in Moscow, the international outlook of a menace to ideological conformity prevailed. The French and the Italian domestic context played a decisive role, indeed, in weakening both major Western communist parties with the additional interference of the United States in Italy. In France, the electoral defeat of the left coalition led communists to sharpen their competition with the socialists. In Italy, the communists' noteworthy electoral success, 1976, led them to join the parliamentary majority, but they were left out of government and then stepped back into opposition in 1979. The failure of the legitimation of the Italian communists as a governing party in a key Western country, as Italy, resulting from a combination of domestic resistance and vetoes from Washington and also from Western European NATO partners, was crucial to undermine Eurocommunism, as the PCI clearly represented its frontline element as an extremely influent national force, hegemonic over the Italian left. Differently from the PCF, the PCI did not decline very significantly and still maintained almost 1/3 of the national electorate after 1979 and for one entire decade. But since it was contained and defeated in the domestic context, the international resonance of Eurocommunism decreased and soon vanished. Nevertheless, and this will be my second basic argument in this paper, even if a Eurocommunist movement declined as its protagonists suffered strategic defeats nationally, the main ideas of reform communism forged during its rise were preserved and developed by the Italian leadership. Thus, clear distinction between the two notions, again, Eurocommunism and reform communism, emerged by the early 1980s. The Eurocommunist season had waned, but the legacy of reform communism was kept alive. the PCI held on to the third way as the linchpin of its political culture and resisted the bloc alignment brought about by the Euro missiles crisis, beginning in 1979. It was the only communist party to play an important role in pacifist mobilization in Western Europe, quite obviously because it could present itself as non-aligned with Moscow. While opposition to NATO's reaction against the Soviet missiles enhanced the Italian communist capacity to play a role among European left forces, their disapproval of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan distanced them significantly from the communist movement. In fact, the invasion of Afghanistan put a definitive end to Eurocommunism as a movement, since the PCF fully approved of the Soviet move. The leading group of the PCI decided not to participate in the Communist Conference convened in Paris in 1980 in order to support the Soviet Union. This was the first time when they did not take part in a conference of the European Communist parties. They developed a criticism of Soviet power politics, even though the main target remained the United States, and expanded their relations with social democracies. Berlinguer was elected at the European Parliament and had talks frequently with François Mitterrand, Willy Brandt, and other socialist leaders. The PCI's construction of networks that included as main partners the Yugoslav communists and their allies in the non-European world, especially the Algerians, was even extended to China. Berlinguer's visit to Beijing, where he met Deng Xiaoping and Hu Yaobang in May 1980, was an obvious symbolic significance and infuriated Moscow. In his meetings, Berlinguer distributed the responsibilities of Moscow and Washington equally in the global crisis and underlined the necessary role of a European community and of non-aligned countries for avoiding a catastrophic outcome. The obvious point of disagreement was the Chinese leaders' assessment of Soviet hegemonism, so-called, as the main danger. But on his return to Rome, Berlinguer presented the relation established with the Chinese communists in a well-tried ecumenical key, which had the sense of constructive networks of deterrence in the context of a deterioration of relations between the superpowers. And he even recognized that the Chinese had not been completely wrong in their perception of Soviet encirclement from Afghanistan to Vietnam. However, Europe remained the main test as the Polish social crisis developed into the creation of a mass opposition to the communist regime. For more than 1 year, September 1980 to December 1981, the Italian communists were made in vain diplomatic efforts to support a negotiated agreement between the Polish party and Solidarność based on recognition of an independent trade union. They warned Moscow they would never accept any use of force. And at the moment of Jaruzelski's coup d'etat, Berlinguer reacted by famously pronouncing his sentence that East European socialism had lost its propulsive thrust. The Soviet response went close to excommunication behind Suslov inspiration, as we know now. In fact, both sides avoided totally breaking relations while maintaining their reciprocal condemnation. This is a well-known story, of course. What matters more to our perspective, it seems to me, is that the positions taken by Berlinguer, firstly on Afghanistan and then on Poland, found some appreciation in Moscow behind the scene. In his diary, a liberal figure such as Anatoly Chernyaev who would become one of the main personalities in Gorbachev's leading group a few years later, wrote in 1982 words of understanding for the Italians' views. I'm quoting, the Italians see their internationalist task in talking of our crisis and the stalemate, because otherwise the party, the communists, might be unprepared before something even worse. They expect turmoil in our camp, which might make the Polish crisis look like a nursery school. Unquote. The largest communist party in the capitalist world, according to Cherniaev, had demonstrated that, quote, the emperor has no clothes, unquote, and that, quote, the international communist movement does not exist anymore, unquote. This was private writing, of course, and even the author could hardly have guessed that just a few years later, similar words would resound at the highest level of power in Moscow. However, we can see how the PCI's position could exercise some influence in the Soviet establishment in spite of hard confrontation with Brezhnev Politburo. Let me draw some conclusion. We should note that Berlinguer's strategy did not intend to build a new movement and even less to join social democracy. He believed that the international communist movement as a political subject had lost any sense. To our knowledge, he first expressed such thinking as early as 1975 in a private conversation with Tito. The Italian communists established an autonomous dialogue with several subjects, but maintained their own stances on crucial points. Their Europeanism and pacifism displayed a political agenda quite close to left-wing socialists. No less significantly, they shared a concern for new issues emerging in the political culture of the European left at the times, such as the downgrading of bipolarism as an outdated world order, the idea of an increased centrality of North-South relations, and openness to themes put forward by ecologists and feminist movements. But there were limits to Italian communism integration into the European left. The idea of a third way between Soviet socialism and social democracy entailed moral accusation against consumerism and an apocalyptic forecast on capitalism's future. Berlinguer underlined the diversity. Berlinguer himself underlined the diversity of the PCI, both in the domestic context and in the landscape of European political cultures, and adhere to the tradition of the October Revolution, now looking at the Soviet experience no more as a model, but as a backward form of socialism. A crucial part of such diversity was the Italian communists' goal of inspiring reform tendencies in the communist political culture and in Soviet-type regimes. This might sound unrealistic in the light of their self-proclaimed isolation, and even more in view of Italy's limited weight in international relations. And still, the invention of the tradition of reform communism had become part of the identity of Italian communism and would play a major role in the last decade of European and Soviet communism as Gorbachev came to power in Moscow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bon, résumé rapide en français, parce que j'ai m'étais engagé, donc je le fais. Donc, Silvio Pons a commencé par rappeler quelques éléments généraux sur l'histoire de l'eurocommunisme en entrant... Ah oui, pardon. Oui, surtout si je fais un résumé. Silvio Pons a commencé par faire un résumé des principales caractéristiques de l'eurocommunisme en entrant assez vite dans une problématique historiographique qui consistait à essayer de se poser la question de la distinction ou de l'accord entre eurocommunisme et communisme réformateur. Donc, dans quelle mesure c'est une part de cette histoire et comment on peut employer ce concept-là. Et assez rapidement, il en est arrivé donc à analyser le rôle spécifique du Parti communiste italien là-dedans, dans la conjoncture internationale. Donc, en rappelant l'accord, évidemment, PCF-PCE, donc avec le PCI, le contexte de décolonisation qui n'est pas à oublier, de la révolution au Portugal et de toute une série d'événements internationaux qui ne sont pas en fait qu'européens, mais qui interfèrent avec l'eurocommunisme. Ce qui revient toujours du coup sur nos questions de définition de l'eurocommunisme, avec l'exception japonaise qui a été, je crois, aussi mentionnée au passage et qui n'est pas effectivement négligeable. Alors, le deuxième aspect de la communication a consisté à essayer de voir s'il y avait en quelque sorte une continuité eurocommuniste, même quand on n'emploie plus le terme, que ce qu'il y a et donc la grosse partie de l'exposé a été consacrée aux différentes initiatives, c'est un résumé, après la fermeture que représente la rupture de l'Afghanistan, quand le PCF soutient l'Afghanistan, etc., l'eurocommunisme en tant que terme même décline, voire disparaît, mais Silvio Pons avance l'idée que à travers notamment les mouvements antimilitaristes, la crise des euromissiles, les contacts maintenus, voire développés avec la Yougoslavie, la Chine, quelles que soient les différences entre les régimes, le PCI cherche à définir en quelque sorte une voie communiste internationale dissidente, tout en discutant avec tous ceux qui sont en fait en désaccord ou à distance de Moscou, et essaye d'impulser entre guillemets une autonomie par rapport à cela. Donc quelques exemples ont été pris. Donc là, je traduis directement une formule qu'il a employée, une sorte de force de l'eurocommunisme après l'épisode eurocommuniste, donc qui valide l'idée d'un communisme réformateur sur la longue durée qui pourrait exister. Et dans les années 80, donc parmi les événements clés de tout cela, outre les rapprochements avec les pays que j'ai soulignés, la question de la position du PCI au moment de la crise polonaise, qui essaie de se positionner comme intermédiaire. Bon, la fameuse formule de Berlinguer qui est évoquée à ce moment-là sur la fin de la force propulsive de la révolution d'octobre. Et ensuite, donc oui, j'ai déjà parlé de la crise des euromissiles, toute une série de positionnements successifs juste avant l'arrivée au pouvoir de Gorbatchev en 85, qui ont essayé de définir une nouvelle voie. Donc voilà, pour résumer, des thèses, c'était que reprendre évidemment la grande séquence de l'eurocommunisme et de voir en fait sa postérité immédiate, qui évidemment, ça n'a pas été dit comme ça, mais qui a eu tendance à être totalement oublié après, puisque comme l'ensemble de l'édifice s'est effondré à l'ouest comme à l'est, mais il y a eu un moment de redéfinition assez intéressant entre 80 et 85. J'espère que j'ai pas trahi, voilà. Merci. J'ai comprends le français, je fais attention. D'autant plus, bien sûr. Je fais attention aussi avant, mais c'est toujours marrant quand on fait les histoires de traduction, parce que vous savez qu'il y a des gens qui comprennent pas certaines langues. Mais bref. So now we speak in English, of course, with
yes.
Our Italian colleague Marco Di Maggio.
I feel better with French, but
but for the seminar,
I must speak English.
Yeah, very good. So Marco Di Maggio, he's in English assistant professor, I can say, in La Sapienza in Roma, of course. He has published several articles and books on Italian communism too. So in French, he has published his PhD, Les intellectuels et la stratégie communiste, une crise d'hégémonie. So it's a book about communist strategy and the intellectuals, published by Éditions Sociales in 2013. And recently, he has published a book in English in the
translated.
Yeah, it was translated, of course, from Italian to English, published by Palgrave, last year, in the series Marx and Marxism, and under the title The Rise and Fall of Communist Parties in France and Italy, Untitled Historical Approaches. And so today he will, of course, speak about Eurocommunism, but especially in the Italian case too, but about the relationship between the Eurocommunism and the question of Europe and the political structure European Indian. So thank you very much, Marco Di Maggio. You have 25 minutes to. Then we have
Avant de passer à l'anglais, je fais une petite introduction en français.
Yes.
En disant que
sorry. Yes.
Alors, avant de passer à l'anglais, j'ai fait une petite introduction en français en disant que peut-être en préparant cette communication, j'ai fait une erreur. Car j'aurais dû me concentrer un peu plus sur les PCF. J'aurais pu. Soit parce que j'étudiais le rôle du PCF dans l'éurocommunisme, soit parce qu'il y a Silvio qui a déjà dit beaucoup de choses comme d'habitude quand j'ai fait des choses avec lui, que j'aurais voulu dire à propos du PC. Mais dans les débats, on va peut-être aborder mieux, car il y a des spécialistes aussi du PCF, la question du Parti communiste français que je vais traiter dans mon paper. Je passe en anglais.
Yes.
And in this paper, I will try to analyze the relation between PCI's internationalism and PCI Europeanism. And I will try to show how PCI's internationalism during the 70s is gradually substituted by Europeanism in PCI political culture during the 70s and 80s. It is not the affirmation of Europeanism it is not only a phenomena that interests PCIs in Italy. I think that the centrality, the affirmation of centrality of Europeanism is a general phenomena for Italian political cultures. That in the different political culture has different time, different forms, but I think that especially in Italy, maybe only in Italy, the affirmation of Europeanism into the political culture is a strong phenomenon in relation with other countries of Europe that are founded European community. And so I will try to analyze Eurocommunism as a particular synthesis between PCI's internationalism and Europeanism. European PCI strategy has a strong oscillation during Berlinguer's leadership. Both historiography and public debate showed different emphasis, sometimes on Berlinguer's Europeanism as the leading force behind the Italian left's adherence to the principles of liberal democracy and human rights, while in other cases stressing the attempt to build a Europe emancipated from the NATO constraints and protagonist in the construction of a more peaceful and equitable multilateralism. In other cases, certain point of view stressed Berlinguer's attempt to defend and update a model of conflictual democracy which put the role of the state power and the European institution at the center, recognizing in this attempt the prerequisites for building an alternative to the technocratic neoliberal system that has inspired the European integration process from the 80s up to the present. All these elements are in the evolution of Italian communism during the Berlinguer Secretary. To follow the evolution of the PCI's relationship with Europe during the Berlinguer Secretary, it is useful to identify three phases. I try to do a periodization. The first phase runs from the PCI's participation to the Communist and Working Parties World Conference held in Moscow in June 1969 and ends in the middle of the 70s. In these years, Berlinguer defined the theoretical and ideal contours of Eurocommunism or of Italian Eurocommunism. The second phase covers the period up to the 1978. It begins with the crisis of detente and hence both with the attainment of maximum cohesion of national solidarity governments in Italy, and ends with dramatically with Berlinguer's death in June 1984. In this last phase, the evolution of the PCI's Europeanism is conditioned by the process of crumbling of the bipolar order and by the acceleration of European integration. Excusez-moi, j'ai fait un bordel. Je recommence parce que j'ai lu des différentes choses. Alors, les trois phases. The third one, no, I did a mistake. The third one, the first phase runs from the PCI from the Prague Spring crisis and ends in the middle of the 70s. The second phase covers the period up to the 1978. It begins with the crisis of detent and ends with the attainment of the maximum cohesion of Eurocommunism. The third phase covered the periods that sees the return of the PCI to opposition in Italy in 1978, and also the rapid decline of detente. And in this phase, the evolution of the PCI Europeanism is conditioned by the crisis of bipolar order. In this first period, in the period 1969-1974, the consolidation of detente, the increasing centrality of the Third World as the main theater of the Cold War, the tragic epilogue of the Prague Spring and the Global 68 constituted the framework within which, between the end of the 60s and the early 70s, the foreign policy of the PCI was redefined. Just before Berlinguer's secretary, the PCI begins to redefine anti-imperialism and internationalism, as Maximilian Graf and also Silvio said. This redefinition of internationalism in a perspective that goes beyond the idea of a socialist camp, and that aim to exploit peaceful coexistence and decolonization process to overcome bipolarity. In this framework, the position on European integration of PCIs changes. The European economic community remains the result of the convergence of interests between the capitalist nation of the old continent which are overwhelmed by anti-colonial revolution, by the workers and anti-imperialist movements within them, and by the strength of the socialist camp. However, since the attempts of Togliatti's polycentrism, the European economic community was recognized as a political space in which to practice the relaunch of a unitary perspective for the workers' movement. The creation of Western European economic space is seen by the PCI as an opportunity to weaken US hegemony. This distinction between the Atlantic bloc and the Western European space was one of the points that, in the 60s above all, divided the PCI from PCF, as is a source of conflict between Italian and French parties. When he took over the leadership of the party, Berlinguer saw in the events of the late 60s and early 70s the confirmation of this strategy. The European dimension of the PCI's policy became the main resource in different aspects. In dealing with the crisis of a communist internationalism after the repression of the Prague Spring, in exploiting the workers' and students' movement overwhelming capitalist order and US hegemony in Western Europe, in building a social relationship between European left-wing organization and the revolutionary movement and states of the Third World. Thus, in the first half of the 70s, the European centrality presents some new elements in PCI's strategy. The first one is improving collaboration with the French party, which in the early 70s is more open to the common political initiative. In fact, with the rise of Georges Marchais and the appointment of Jean Canepa as the party's foreign chief, the PCF also seemed to recognize the specificity of the Western European space as one of the fields of the voie française au socialisme. The most significant result of this convergence can be seen in the Conference of European Communist Party held in Brussels in January 1974. However, in the face of apparent unity, the PCI leadership saw contradictions and ambiguities in the position of the French, who continued to oppose an organic collaboration of Western European communists independent from Moscow's conditioning. The second element is the support of international detente, which is the main condition for the development of a constant dialogue with the other left-wing forces on the continent, starting with the German social democracy, which is the protagonist of Ostpolitik. Berlinguer's PCI can play a relevant role as a political and cultural mediator between European left-wing forces, communists, social democrats, and Catholics, national liberation movements, and the socialist camp. In this context, the development of economic cooperation between the European community and the new states of the Third World is seen as a valid alternative to neocolonialism. Pinochet's push on 11 September 1973 strengthens the idea that the convergence between democratic forces in an anti-fascist faction is necessary to stop the reactionary strategy of the US and their allies. The frontist paradigm of the anti-fascist unity remains one of the main concepts of PCI's political culture, and it continues to inspire PCI's politics both in the national and the international dimension. PCI aims for a gradual recomposing of the European workers' movement, which could have been favored by the alliance between communists and socialists in France, by unitary action of the European democratic forces against the spread of the Chilean model in Europe, especially in Italy, and in the Third World. The idea behind Berlinguer's strategy was that a Western Europe hegemonized by left-wing forces could stop US penetration in the Third World, which was likely to use racist and fascist regimes. In this sense, the dialogue between PCI and European social democrats intensified, leading to a revision of the PCI's analysis of global polarities, no longer divided just into East and West, but also into North and South. The last element is that PCI should have played a vanguard role in the communist movement, encouraging reform processes in socialist countries, which has been stifled by the repression of abject socialism with the human face. In March 1972, Berlinguer defined this strategy with the formula of a Europe that is neither anti-Soviet nor anti-American. This formula represents a dynamic conception of international detente in which Western Europe was to take the lead in a progressive movement towards overcoming bipolarity and moving towards socialism. The international class struggle of the early years of the Cold War is now an outdated concept for PCI. The second period begins in the middle of the decade. Berlinguer's internationalism had to reckon with the changes in the world and continental scenario. In addition to the end of Bretton Woods, which undermined the fundamentals on which the European integration process had been built, from 1974 onwards, the collapse of the Southern European dictatorship seemed to upset the balance of power in Europe. In particular, the Portuguese Revolution of the Carnation is one of the main testing grounds for Berlinguer's strategy. Socialist International has a leading role in the democratic transition of Greece, Spain, and Portugal by anchoring it in the European integration and avoiding the possibility of recourse to authoritarian projects. This leading role of socialist forces avoids and weakens any frontist hypothesis, with the Spanish, Greek, and Portuguese communist parties rapidly sliding towards irrelevance and identity withdrawal. At the same time, European socialist parties, especially German Social Democracy, are involved in the elaboration of financial stabilization programs drawn up in the few forums of international economic cooperation, such as the G7. In France, faced with the growth of Mitterrand's Socialist Party, PCF began to attack the basis of the political convergence around the process of continental detente. However, until 1978, Western... Qu'est-ce qui se passe?
Un intermède de Serge Volikov.
C'est ça, c'est un sabotage de Serge.
C'est les orthodoxes qui se lèvent contre le SPD, justement. Ça arrive au bon moment.
Contre les social-démocrates.
Contre la négociation.
Alors, je dis, I say, tu parles une autre langue.
Sorry.
Je passe. Tu provoques de la confusion. Alors, in France, however, until 1978, Western European communism continued to convey the image of convergence around the idea of a revolutionary strategy combining socialism and democracy, autonomy and internationalism. Also, after the socialist-communist split in Portugal and France, Western communist parties' collaboration continued to arouse the enthusiasm of militants and the intellectuals in Southern Europe. The possibility of a new democratic society also attracts the attention of the components of the leading groups in the East, which aimed to pick up the road of reforming communism interrupted by Czechoslovakian repression. In short, when it reached the peak of its visibility, in this period, the press coined the definition of Eurocommunism, the convergence between the Western Communist Party showed all its limits. In June 1977, Berlinguer gave the famous interview which was interpreted as the symbol of the downsizing of PCI's anti-Americanism. On this occasion, he went beyond recognizing that Italy belonged to the Western camp. For the first time, he accepted the bipolar division as a fact, and he acknowledged Italy's place in the Atlantic Pact. At this point, the medium-term target of the PCI is not the dissolution of the blocs. Mutual recognition is sanctioned by the Helsinki Conference, but the construction of a Western Europe that plays a bridging role between East and West and North and South. Confronted with the crisis of communist movement and with the weakness of Eurocommunists, Berlinguer tries to combine the Italian way to socialism with a wished Europe, democratic, cooperative, and committed to building a peaceful and multipolar world. Apart from the collaboration with the Swedish Social Democracy in the Third War, the European mobilization against authoritarian regimes in Africa and Latin America, and the interest of important sector of the German Social Democracy, the PCI was not able to avoid the German Social Democracy and British Labour governments German Social Democracy and British Labour governments participate to the Western veto for its admission into the Italian government. The end of the 70s opened the third period. The agreement between Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt, which gave rise to the European monetary system, opened a new phase in the history of European integration process. After the Second World War, European integration was a space that had favored a rebuilding state, and thus it was a vehicle for the reaffirmation of national sovereignty on new bases. From the end of the 70s, the European integration process began to turn into a force for overcoming the constraints placed on financial capital and European enterprises by states, workers' organizations, and national political cultures. The debate on Italy's entering into the European monetary system, which took place between 1978 and 1979, was the first manifestation of Berlinguer's difficulties in maintaining the unity of the leading group of the party around the policy development in the previous years. At the 50th Congress, which took place in Rome at the end of March 1979, Berlinguer stresses the need for a third way to socialism as an alternative to the crisis of both the Soviet and the social democratic model. The last one unable to meet the challenges posed by the global shock. These themes entered in the first electoral campaign for the direct election of the European Parliament. The PCI reached almost 30%. On 19 July, Berlinguer pronounced the opening speech at the Strasbourg Assembly on behalf of the entire Communist and Allied group. He still made explicit reference to Eurocommunism. However, his speech also contained the important point of a common statute for all European workers, guaranteeing an equal basis of rights both to those who are citizens of the member states and to those who come from outside the EEC. In the early 80s, the Socialist and Social Democratic leadership groups showed interest in Berlinguer's idealistic impetus. However, Berlinguer's European policy with its neutralist and socialist overtones constituted an objective obstacle to the construction of organic relations between PCIs and the parties of the Socialist International. This is demonstrated by the rapid decline of the PCI's dialogue with the French socialists in the aftermath of Mitterrand's election. Regarding the relations between EEC and the Global South, at the beginning of the 80s, Italian communist leaders remarked that many socialist-led European governments, primarily the French, were doing little to change their country's economic and political relation with their former colonies. Deprived of a real political ground, the Italian communist elaboration on the role of the EEC in the establishment of new economic relations and of a new peaceful international order progressively slips into a purely ideological dimension. Collaboration with the other continental left-wing party was consolidated mainly by mobilizing for the respect of human rights, as in the case of the fight against the racist regime in South Africa, and the repression of dissent in the country of Eastern Europe, and become detached from the target of building a new type of economic and political relations. On 15 September 1983, Berlinguer spoke in Strasbourg during the debate on the draft treaty of the European Union and confirmed his critical point of view on the evolution of the community and its role in the world. He emphasized how some states were acting on a purely accounting basis, while the European economic was leaving its way to the US and Japan. He therefore affirmed the need for coordinated public intervention within the community, which represented a European alternative to the economic policy of Reagan and Thatcher, and which was built by strengthening the democratic foundation of the community institutions. Berlinguer said that all the ruling classes, the economic and political groups were incapable of leading a process that would give Europe a renewed impetus. This is why, he said, it is vital that the main aim of Europe must be affirming in the world its role of progress and peace. To do this, the leading role in the European community building has to be taken up by the working classes in all their expressions. In this phase, Berlinguer's criticism of the democratic deficit of the EEC became the core of the PCI's Europeanism. The PCI overlooked the new economic dynamics of the European integration process as a part of the shaping of the new structures of post-Keynesian capitalism, which reconfigured the role of national sovereignty. However, the PCI's Europeanism tended to focus more and more on political, institutional, and foreign policy aspects, rather than on economic policy. In the face of evolution and increasing centrality of a pro-European rhetoric, the communist political discourse remained stuck on the idea of neoliberalism as an expression of the crisis of capitalism, or on European integration as a vehicle of modernization and democratization that was unavoidable. In the last months of Berlinguer's secretariat, the decline of the European peace movements, the crumbling of the Third World, the growth of international tensions, and the isolation of the PCI in Italy restricted the space for a political initiative. The European and Eurocentric dimension tend to become the cultural reference and privileged political privileged political space of the PCI, definitively replacing communist internationalism. In the early 80s, therefore, Berlinguer's Europeanism is a prefiguration of a wished Europe, which denounces the limits of the real Europe. It is an ideological discourse, the main function of which is to react to the crumbling of the bipolar world and the advance of globalization, which inexorably reduce all the conditions that had allowed the PCI to become the only communist party not in power with an autonomous and effective foreign and European policy. The European discourse of the last Berlinguer was part of an ethical conception which conceived the fight for socialism as the progressive overcoming of capitalism damages. The ethical ideological approach of the last Berlinguer has been defined by some scholars as populist or anti-modern. According to me, however, the ideological retreat in this year is an expression of the crisis of the forms of 20th century politics, in which PCI lost basis of its political action, both in a national and international context. Reference to Berlinguer's idea of Europe, mainly for its ideological and political ethical characteristics, had been constantly reworked and readapted by many of his successors to justify the evolutions and then the transformation of the PCI after the end of the Cold War. At the same time, the opponents of the PCI's dissolution would also claim Berlinguer's conception of Europeanism internationalism in defense of the originality of Italian communism. The reference to Eurocommunism and Berlinguer's idea of Europe will continue to be present in Italy and elsewhere in many expressions of left-wing Europeanism so far. Grazie, merci.
Merci.
Sorry for confusion.
Peux-tu te résumer toi-même en français?
Oui, si tu veux.
Bah non, mais tu vas lui faire mieux que moi. Enfin, je connais.
Tu n'as pas envie de faire l'effort. Non, je l'ai dit au début, j'ai essayé de faire un peu, d'analyser les liens, la relation entre l'évolution de l'internationalisme du PCI et de sa tentative aussi de développer un internationalisme communiste réformateur, comme a été dit, et l'idée d'Europe, la stratégie européenne du Parti communiste italien et comment l'européisme tendent progressivement pendant les secrétariats de Berlinguer à se substituer à l'internationalisme communiste qui est en crise. Et l'eurocommunisme, comme a été dit par Silvio, c'est un des acteurs qui accélère la crise de l'internationalisme communiste. En faisant ça, j'ai essayé de faire une périodisation qui alors, en trois périodes. La première période, c'est la période qui va de 1969 jusqu'à la moitié des années 70. La deuxième période arrive de la moitié des années 70 jusqu'à 78. Et la troisième période commence à la fin des années 70 et termine, au moins on peut la faire terminer avec la fin du secrétariat de Berlinguer avec sa mort en 1984. Dans ces trois phases sont liées soit au développement du contexte international, soit au développement du contexte européen, mais aussi, si on va analyser les cas spécifiques des PCI, au développement du contexte italien. Et là, on voit aussi comment la fin de l'ordre du bipolarisme international, c'est aussi un progressif effondrement des espaces qui avait permis au PCI de jouer un rôle dans les cadres soit du mouvement communiste international, soit au niveau international par rapport aux pays sortis de la colonisation et aussi par rapport aux social-démocraties. Et cette restriction des espaces amène les PCI à développer de plus en plus un discours qui est de plus en plus idéologique, parce qu'il perd progressivement les espaces pour le développement d'une initiative politique réelle. Voilà, okay. C'est ça en synthèse.
J'essaie de tout suivre en même temps, les SMS que je reçois, l'écran. Je suis perdu là, le dernier.
En fait, il y a Jean-Vidro qui a fait une petite remarque dans le chat. Voilà.
Et de quelle nature? Tu peux mettre l'écran complet.
La première intervention où il note la spécificité des partis communistes espagnol, italien et français dans l'épreuve de force qu'ils essayent de construire.
Comment vous faites? Je propose le dernier papier et rapidement en résumé, puisque le collègue n'est pas. So the last paper, because the colleague is not here, he's ill, but thanks to Maximilian to read it. I just briefly introduce the colleague, Francesco Di Palma. He's a historian too. He worked at the Freie Universität in Berlin. And he recently, a few months ago, I think so, his PhD on Eurocommunism, habilitation on Eurocommunism. It's other level, sorry. Trouble for Moscow, so auf Deutsch, der Eurokommunismus und die Beziehungen der Sozialistischen Einheitspartei Deutschland mit der Kommunistischen Partei Frankreich und Italiens. So in English, so the Eurocommunism and the relationship between the Socialist Unified Party in East Germany and the French Communist Party and Italian Communist Party from 1968 to 1989. And so he has published other articles on the subject, and so with Maximilian, he will publish a collection of texts with numerous unpublished archives on the history of Eurocommunism. So please and thank you for read this paper.
Actually, the paper is about 10 pages long, so I was asked to shorten it a bit to bring it down to
yes, I come back
about 20 to 25 minutes. So I'm trying my best, and I really hope that I don't cut out anything that Francesco would have liked to have in if he had to shorten it himself. First of all, he thanks very much for the invitation, and he would have loved to be here, but unfortunately he fell sick, so he had to cancel on short notice. It would have been a great chance for him to present his volume already introduced by Jean-Numa. The subject of his book is an investigation of, as the title reveals, the relationships and interdependencies between these three parties. On the one hand, constellations of mutual influence were analyzed in the period from 1968 to 89-90, including attempts at rapprochement and cooperation, as well as blockades and disputes. Likewise, cross-references to other influential organizations, such as the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party, or the PS, Partie Socialiste, but also to non-socialist, non-communist forces have been examined. On the other hand, the East German Westpolitik took center stage in order to present the respective mutual connections in more depth. Institutional levels below and outside the respective party leadership were also systematically explored, including, above all, the areas of friendship societies, regional organizations, and twin cities. The study started out from two assumptions, which could be confirmed to a large extent and differentiated depending on the time period. First, it was shown that the SED's relations with the two most important Western European brother parties were mostly determined by calculation and opportunism. Secondly, it could be proven that in addition to the central committee of the respective parties, lower-ranking departments and subsidiary organizations, often only slightly regulated or semi-autonomously, influence the orientation of foreign policy and external relations. Francesco intended to present selected results, and he aimed to proceed in 3 steps. In the first section, a short outline of the main findings of the study, and in the second step, a more detailed discussion of 2 specific case studies, which would have been the activities of the SED basic organizations abroad and the importance of town twinning. So I decided to cut out the town twinning section and proceed with the conclusions on both sections. So you have to read his book if you want to learn more about the town twinning's role in party relationships. And in the end, naturally, he aimed to frame his work into the broader research of the topic. Okay, I'm continuing to read out sources.
We have a problem for 2 minutes.
Okay, well, they are gone. Okay, and towards the very end of finishing his book, he also had the chance to include Russian sources, which we all know is not going to be possible in the near future. So the analytical part of his presentation, which I will read now, starts with the year 1968. With the crushing of the Prague Spring, had a lasting impact on trilateral relations. PGE and PCF were at a turning point in their history. After initial hesitation, the latter approved, as late as November 1968, military intervention in Czechoslovakia, thus reaffirming its traditional pro-Soviet orientation. The PGE, on the other hand, intensified its dialogue with socialist and social democratic parties in Western Europe and subjected Marxism-Leninism to an even sharper criticism. The Italians, under the leadership of the charismatic General Secretary Luigi Longo and his successor Enrico Berlinguer, gradually set the course for their partial independence from Moscow. The SED expressly disapproved of this breakaway policy of the Italians, but did not sever their ties with the major Western European party. This occurred because the East Germans reckoned with an intensification of their relations with Rome, despite all the ideological differences with the Italian comrades, above all to attain self-interested advantages. The PCF, with its General Secretary, Georges Marchais, who had replaced Waldeck Rocher in 1972, remained in line from the SED's point of view anyway, which in turn caused lasting resentment and insecurity within the party base, especially among intellectuals and students. The Italians' capacity for successful self-renewal, however, did not come about overnight. The party, which had been under the undisputed leadership of Berlinguer and his entourage since the early 1970s, was consistently committed to the new political line by the new guard. Such a renewal process had not been possible in France for a variety of reasons. The PCF was never able to develop beyond the status of a mass cater party. This was not possible even during his participation in the Union de la Gauche from 1972 to 1977. As a partner of the PS around François Mitterrand, although leading PCF politicians took the opportunity during this phase to criticize the CPSU. The abrupt departure of the PCF from the left union after the PS won the local elections in March 1977 led, among other things, to a rapprochement between the French communists and the Eastern Bloc and promoted the intensification of bilateral ties to the SED. The reaction of the state socialist parties was astounding. As reconstructed through archival records, the break in the alliance with Mitterrand initially surprised both the SED and the CPSU, and even displeased both parties. According to the East German observers, the PCF board was way too inward-looking, too nationalistic. As a result, it would probably no longer be possible to exert any influence on the rising PS. For a long time, the term Eurocommunism was considered so ambiguous that several Western European communist parties initially rejected the doctrine or dismissed it as a journalistic intervention. Frane Barbieri's designation was indeed not without controversy. On the one hand, according to their critics, the prefix Euro points to a continental definition and thus completely ignores several non-European CPs with quite similar tendencies. On the other hand, the singular form is misleading and evokes a Moscow opposite in a European Communist center with a leadership function, which does not correspond to the reality and the foundation of Eurocommunism, namely the trading of a national path to communism. The proponents of the doctrine had in mind a democratic communism that would contribute to pacifying the world and overcoming the logic of the blocs, both nationally and internationally or supranationally. This meant acceptance of the Western European integration organs in order to bring about their democratization from within and, above all, independence from the US. But also acknowledging that the role model function of the CPSU has indeed expired. Against this background, the PGE was seen from the outset as the most influential representative, with Berlinguer and Santiago Carrillo as the pioneers of this new communism, so to speak. Dating the Eurocommunist era turns out to be particularly complicated. Some historians point to 1968 as the starting date. The ideological divide between East and West communism widened visibly after the differences of opinion regarding the Soviet approach to Alexander Dubček's socialism with a human face and the suppression of the Prague Spring by Warsaw Pact troops in the summer of the same year. A schism in continental communism threatened. During this phase, the Soviet Union model, which had previously also been idealized in the Western European Communist parties, was increasingly called into question, so that the Western European communists gradually distanced themselves from and became alienated from the CPSU, a process that had started at latest in 1956. As the reactions to the crushing of the Prague Spring showed, this partial autonomy of the communist parties in Italy and France turned out very differently. While the PGE and the Spanish Communist Party sharply condemned the military deployment of Soviet forces in Czechoslovakia, the PCF, after a brief period of criticism, returned to a conciliatory stance towards the Moscow authorities. But what are the political characteristics to define Eurocommunism? Well, this question is again difficult to answer, as the motives and goals of the respective Eurocommunist parties differed greatly from one another in some cases. However, a particularly influential Eurocommunist publication can serve as a guide: Santiago Carrillo's Eurocommunism and the State, published in 1977. In it, he drew attention to the fact that the class structure in the Western capitalist countries were fundamentally different from those in the Soviet Union. This led, among other things, to the increased Soviet repressive violence. In short, the Soviet model was no longer up to date for Western communist parties. But how is socialism to be built in capitalist countries at all? The state has a key role to play in this. As you know, Marx and Lenin called for the destruction of the state, which they saw as an instrument of power for the bourgeoisie. Carrillo warns against hasty steps and pleads for a compromise. Eurocommunists should prepare themselves for a transitional stage during which the broadest possible supporter base could be created. This must be such a broader. This must be much broader than usual. Not only involve the traditional electorate of the working class, but also neighboring social classes and institutions, schools, press, religion, and so on. For the socialism project, Carrillo also advised caution in the economic area. The catastrophic effects of the socialist planned economy were obvious. Capitalism was though also plagued by cyclical crisis. The Eurocommunists therefore had in mind a mixed economy that would absorb the disadvantages of both the planned economy and unbridled capitalism. This transitional phase, in which private ownership would persist while collectivization, nationalization measures be in full swing, would set the course for the transformation of society from a liberal capitalist leaning to a socialist one. Of course, this transition should take place in stages, and all civil liberties continue to be respected. Carrillo also made it clear that Eurocommunism cannot be perceived as a form of social democracy in disguise, unlike social democracy. Eurocommunism actually intends to overthrow the capitalist system and establish a socialist society. The SED, much alike its Eastern European allies, uncompromisingly rejected Eurocommunism as a revisionist doctrine from its inception onwards. The PCF flirted with reform communism, mostly for electoral opportunistic reasons, but never completely freed itself from Moscow's paternalism. The PGE supported the European Parliament as a supranational institution because, according to it, an independent goal should be created as a mediator between the superpowers. This is where PGE and PCF differed fundamentally. After the end of the Left Union in 1977, the PCF returned just as quickly to its old negative attitude towards the EC, which it itself defended in its view of the first direct elections to the European Parliament in 1979, for which the PGE in particular had campaigned decisively. In the early 1970s, the SED benefited from the Basic Treaty with the Federal Republic, which led to the recognition and anchoring of the GDR in the international community. It could now begin to develop the existing contexts with the West and establish new ones. The SED chose the PGE as her preferred contact in the West, regardless of the Italians further turning away from Marxism-Leninism. It was already clear at the beginning of the 1970s that contacts to secure advantages in France were only sporadically initiated via the PCF, while the PGE was regarded as the indispensable contact and mediator in Italy. This circumstance can hardly be explained ideologically, but only in terms of realpolitik. This did not change even when the differences of opinion between the PGE and SED on the occasion of the crisis in Afghanistan seemed irreconcilable. At the beginning of 1980, the PGE vehemently denounced the invasion of Soviet troops in Afghanistan, unlike, for example, the PCF, which adopted a conciliatory stance. In the European Parliament, the Italians intensified their cooperation with socialist and social democratic forces. Together with these, they finally demanded the prompt withdrawal of the Soviet troops from the occupied territories. A new ideological phase of development in the history of the PGE thus took shape. It was characterized by a strategic opening towards liberal and democratic Western Europe. Since I've been asked to cut a bit, Francesco continues with remarks, especially on the economic situation of the East German state, and that this economic situation also influenced its international work, and funds were cut for certain corporations, and so on and so on. The case studies that follow in his analysis show basically that those basic organizations, so the East German missions abroad, at the East German embassies, and so on and so on. There was always an organization of the SED, and they held those meetings and to show that there is a lot of deviations from the official party line. And you can see this never turns into opposition until the very end, but you can clearly see that